Hello Daily Drafters and welcome to the format follow-up video for Phyrexia All Will Be One. We didn't really have a ton of time with this format, but it is now time to say goodbye in true daily draft fashion. What that means exactly is that in this video I will provide you with color pair tier rankings, followed by my top 10 takes on the format. If you have any desire to draft Phyrexia again in the future, such as a flashback draft on Arena or at home with your friends, this will be a great video to reference to give you a quick reminder of how the format shook out and what to be looking for during your revisits. With that out of the way, let's dive into today's video. Starting with the tier 4 decks, I've got a large clump of 4 decks, including blue-green, blue-red, black-red, and blue-black. None of these decks really delivered on what was advertised. Their strategies were either too slow or too unfocused to compete with the best decks in the format. If I were drafting in a high-stakes Phyrexia draft tomorrow, I would hope to not end up in one of these spots. In tier 3, I have blue-white and black-green. I don't think these decks were outstanding, but I think they came together slightly more often than the tier 4 decks. Blue-white was exclusively an artifact deck, and if it was open, I think you could get a pretty powerful version of the deck. Black-green was advertised as a toxic deck, but really just ended up being a deck full of good green cards supported by black removal and rares. But when you got a good version of that deck, I think you didn't feel too bad about your spot. In tier 2, I have red-white, black-white, and green-white. Now, both black-white and green-white were the most toxic decks in the format, really trying to keep your curve incredibly low and full of toxic creatures. They were incredibly aggressive decks that I had a ton of success with in the format and really enjoyed playing and drafting. Red-white was your typical aggro deck, full of 4 Mirrodin equipment that just gave you tons of value and staying power into the late game, but as good as these decks were, none of them could compete with the best version of our only tier 1 deck, and that is red-green. Red-green was the menace of the format, and strangely not really because of oil counters, which is what was advertised to us. Red-green ended up being a very typical mid-range deck with incredibly well-costed and statted creatures like Chimney Rabble and Furnace Strider, backed up by efficient removal like Hexgold Slash and Volt Charge, and had great rares and mythics available to it. If you got a 10 out of 10 red-green deck in the format, there was hardly anything anyone could do to stand in the way of you getting your trophy. Now we'll go ahead and dive into my top 10 takes on the format as a whole. Number 10. Dune Mover was the glue in aggressive toxic decks. I just love this little guy. I started the format pretty low on this card, but rapidly moved it higher and higher in my pick order, so much so that I believe I took a Dune Mover pack 1 pick 1 in my last Phyrexia draft here on the channel. If your deck was in the market for a 2-mana 2/1 Toxic 1, I'd play as many Dune Movers as I could get, because this card guarantees you don't miss your third land drop, and that you don't get color screwed. What more could you want? Number 9. 4 Mirrodin was a great limited mechanic. Maybe even too great. I think it was very well balanced, and could have gotten out of hand, but it didn't. A lot of the 4 Mirrodin equipment were just great values, and even the underwhelming ones had some good effects on the game. The fact that these all came with a 2/2, and you could even choose to just immediately move the equipment to a better creature and be left with that 2/2, meant that it wasn't an embarrassment if you had to include several in your deck. Number 8. This was not the format for tap lands. The Sphere lands looked like nice little value lands that you would be able to cash in for a card in the late game. And while that did prove to be true, you never really got to the late game very often. Not to mention the fact that these entered the battlefield tapped, which meant that you were put in some really awkward situations early in the game when you kept a 2-lander with one of your lands being a sphere and really wanted to make sure you curved out with a 1-drop, 2-drop, and 3-drop. I started the format running 2 to 3 of these in each deck, and ended the format usually running 0 or 1. Number 7. The official daily draft color rankings. In 5th, and potentially contentious, I have black. In 4th, narrowly edging out black, is blue. In 3rd, miles ahead of both number 4 and 5, is green. In a close 2nd, I have white. And in a runaway victory, I have red in 1st. Number 6. 6 and 7 mana cards were close to unplayable. Cards like Kaya, Ovika, and Tyranax Rex seemed like huge, flashy bombs, and in any other format, they would be. But in this format, you really just didn't have time to include a 7 or 8 mana card in your deck. You were usually dead before you could cast it. As sweet as Kaya seems, I actually wheeled her in 2 separate drafts in this format, and she didn't even make my deck in either of those cases. Number 5. The top commons in each color. In black, I have Anoint with Affliction. In blue, I have Gitaxian Raptor, but in blue's best deck, which was blue-white artifacts, I think Eye of Malcator deserves an honorable mention. In green, I've got an easy Contagious Vorak. In white, and this one ended up being pretty close by the end of the format, I still have Planar Disruption. And in red, a pick that we may not have seen coming in week 1, but we can all agree on now, I have Hexcold Slash. Number 4. We are seeing fewer and fewer fun and interesting build-arounds with each new set. We used to get a ton of fun build-arounds at the Uncommon and Rare rarities several years ago, but those cards are few and far between nowadays. Cards like Roost of Drakes, Disinformation Campaign, and Ongoing Investigation are cards that really don't do much on their own, but they kind of get the ball rolling and then really pay you off if you do the thing. We just aren't seeing cards like this much anymore, and that's a huge bummer for a lot of players who would just love to do some sweet, goofy things. Number 3. Poison kills were less common than we originally thought. It turns out that the way Toxic works, in that it deals both poison and combat damage to your opponent, meant that most of the time you usually killed your opponent with regular damage before you were able to give them their 10th poison counter. And sometimes they would even happen simultaneously. If you built your deck as a super aggressive Toxic deck with tons of 1 and 2 drops, you usually just functioned as any aggro deck in any other format would, and would just kill your opponent with 20 damage. So just find good, cheap creatures, and you should be good to go. Number 2. This format requires an entirely new approach to gameplay. If you didn't have a 2-drop in this format, you were already incredibly far behind. And if you didn't have a single play in the first 3 turns of the game, you may have well conceded. It was incredibly important to get on board early and to affect your opponent's plays early and often in Phyrexia, because if you didn't, your opponent certainly did, and would usually kill you quickly and swiftly. For those of you that didn't subscribe to this school of thought early into the format, this is likely the reason why so many people call this format one of the worst of all time in the first week, because they were probably losing a ton. The format wasn't actually that bad. You were just playing checkers while everyone else was playing chess. And that brings us to my number 1 point on the format, which is that this format was actually good. If you subscribe to the school of thought that I just laid out in my number 2 point, you probably won a lot in Phyrexia. In my first 8 drafts of Phyrexia here on the channel, I had just 1 trophy and had a record of 24 and 23, a win percentage of 51.1%. In my next 13 drafts, after I had figured out how this format needed to be played, I had 5 trophies, a record of 62 and 32, and a win percentage of 66%. And let me tell you, when you're winning that much, you will be having fun. If you only did 5 or so drafts of Phyrexia, I can see how you might have hated it and wrote it off. But all it takes is to know how to draft each format to start winning a lot and having a lot of fun. There's just not much more to it. Thanks so much for tuning in to the channel for the life of Phyrexia All Will Be One. And if you didn't get to see many drafts, or you just happened to discover this format follow-up video, go ahead and subscribe to the channel to get in nice and early on the next format. We'll be switching focus to March of the Machine tomorrow and into next week with several set review videos. Thanks again for being here, and I will see you soon for more daily draft content.